I am very pleased to announce the presence of Judge Dennis Davis. Now, Judge Dennis Davis, many of you may know him. He is the judge of the Western Cape High Court and the judge president of the Competition Appeal Court, and also the honorary professor of commercial law at the University of Cape Town.
This comes from an article by a Stellenbosch academic van Fintel, Fintel. South Africa's economy consistently ranks amongst the lowest internationally when it comes to firms' discretion about wages that they pay their employees. Rigid labor laws and strong unions are regularly cited as constraints to employment creation, with wages growing faster than labor productivity. Despite high structural unemployment, wage demands have not moderated even during downturns in economic activity. Collective bargaining agreements have also contributed to the situation, with substantial wage premia that limit job creation capacity, especially amongst smaller firms. Legally, wages that are negotiated between groups of firms and unions can be then extended to entire industries, even to firms with only non-unionized workers. As a result, many firms have little discretion with regard to the wages that they pay, with wage setting for removed from an individual work firm match. That's, I'm not quite sure if you'd call it conventional wisdom, but it is certainly a view. There was a book by a chap called Franz Rotenbach, and his argument is, following this, that the advent of trade unions and the protection that unions are given under the South African Labour Relations Act and the other pieces of legislation, that they, in a sense, are no more than rent-seeking exercise. They capture the rents for a certain group, and unless you get rid of that, you are going to find yourselves in a horrendous situation in South Africa. The other point I want to make, which comes from Professor Nicoli Nattrass, Nattrass, it's called South Africa, Post-Apartheid Democracy and Growth. And this is an article published around about 2013, 2014. So the figures are only to 2012, but I suspect that these figures are equally applicable to South Africa in the year 2017. She's comparing South Africa to Brazil. The lack of opportunities for unskilled South Africans to find informal or low-paid work is an important driver of poverty and inequality. She poses the following question, which is central to what I think we're going to be talking about today. There is a question of why organized labor, perhaps we can put in parentheses government, is so unconcerned about the trade-off between wages and employment. We set out in 1995 to infuse into our constitution certain basic rights for workers: the right to strike, the right to organize, are central rights, rights to form trade unions, central rights, labor rights, enshrined in the Constitution. And then, in addition to which, our Labour Relations Act was a social democratic institution. Effectively, on the individual side, as you know, there are now serious protections against dismissal. On the collective side, we know that the Act introduced a form of collective bargaining which was centralized. And we also know under Section 32 of the Labour Relations Act, controversy is this: you aren't part of the bargaining council, your workers aren't unionized, but you work in that industry. And if the minister can extend the agreement that was entered into between the union employers to you as an employer, and you have to pay those wages and those conditions of employment. So those were the core areas. They were core social democratic features of labour relations. They were based on the proposition that workers are less empowered than employers, and therefore the question of connectivity was important to provide collective workers with sufficient power to equalize the imbalance in power. Within that context, we now know that we have a Labour Relations Act which is controversial, that in fact, if you take the argument perhaps of Mayor Mashaba or Mr. Rotenbach, you come to the view we need to get rid of this law, we need to be far more flexible. Our laws are inflexible. You can't hire and fire wages are too high, therefore people won't employ. And in an economy such as South Africa, that has to occur, and therefore we've got us horribly wrong, and our structures are in effect totally and utterly counterproductive. I'm particularly interested in whether you think that the particular structure that I outlined, which you would know fairly well, is something we should radically change.
I feel without our Labour Relations Act and trade unions, employers would be exploiting be it lower skilled employees. And for that, I feel that it is necessary that we do have them.
I would say that many of the labour laws and unions are there for the already employed, and do not really cater for those who are outside the job market, and that's the problem.
If you take away these rights, and in a sense have an unfettered market, you exacerbate inequality, you increase powerlessness in the context of a country emerging out of 300 years of racist and sexist rule.
I work in the IT space. I can't have the same type of Labour Relations Act. You employ people, and people think that they have a job for life. Okay. The fact that in IT you need to be dynamic. If you're not dynamic, you lose competitiveness. And then people just sit on the bench because they believe that they can just have a job and do not go the extra mile.
Why do they think they can have a job in your industry?
Because the law protects them.
So you're also complaining about the flexibility problem.
Yes.
I thought you were going to say to me, part of the problem is because we've got such an awful education system in this country. It's another side, but it's a related side. Would you not agree?
Absolutely. In my understanding, the labour laws in the United Kingdom are even more rigid than the ones that we have here in South Africa. So now, making that comparison, can we really say the rigidity of your labour laws really has an effect?
But there's a very interesting article by Haroon Borat, B-H-O-R-T, who's a labour economist at University of Cape Town, and Holton Cheadle, who is the principal drafter of the LRA, an article called Labour Reform in South Africa, Measuring Regulation and a Synthesis of Policy Suggestions. They do a study of labour relations and regulation around the world. It's the hiring and firing rigidity measures which are noticeably above the world mean. So costs are lower, but there's rigidity in getting the person fired. And so if you read their paper, it is true that we're not nearly as bad as people suggest, but there's massive room for improvement in areas. Just let's try to draw back and summarize the contributions that you all made, which have been fabulous, by the way. We've been introduced to two competing visions, if I could put it that way. The imbalances of power in South Africa, both in relation to local and multinational capital, is such that the argument is actually it's quite important to have some of these protections that we've got, and that they're not necessarily deleterious to the economy. They are, in fact, important for social and economic stability. In addition to which, there are a whole lot of other factors that we never take account of. So, for example, on that side of the equation, it's true that the Chinese wages were very low, but it's also true that the Chinese had a social wage, that to a large degree, the Chinese state provided people with a whole range of goods which we don't produce, we don't provide, and if we do provide, we provide in very dire and inefficient circumstances. And then we also forget other factors, that apartheid geography increased transport costs for the poorest to the poor. On the other side, the argument is, but if you've got huge pools of unemployed labour, on the one hand, and you're trying to be internationally competitive, labour costs do count. And to some extent, the idea of inflexibility, I can't fire, I can't get rid of people, I can't bring in other people. I need to actually think out of the box and have a more flexible system, would dictate that we borrowed a system that is inappropriate to the South African economy. Now, let me pause. It's very interesting how many of you actually took the first line with qualifications, because I wouldn't have guessed that. No disrespect, in an MBA school, even with our labour law, the kind of supply and demand seems to operate over the longer term far more efficiently than the critics of the Labour Relations Act seems to suggest. If you go back to the Cheadle-Borat paper, what they say, and I think there's some truth in this, is at the end of the Labour Relations Act there's an appendix called the Code of Conduct, which is supposed to advise employers as to how to go about the business. And the trouble about it is it was supposed to be updated, and it was supposed to be used as informal as possible. And if we followed that, in fact, we would reduce the costs of hiring and firing, because the speed of hiring and firing is not much different from anywhere else in the world. The further point that they make is that we could make certain amendments that we should do, particularly with regard to probation, that we should be more flexible about probation. I mentioned earlier, and I thought people would raise this, extension of bargaining agreements under Section 32, meaning it can't be right that the minister can extend conditions of employment to people who aren't unionized. Right? That kind of prevents employment taking place. The court said, actually it's not so terrible, because the minister has to act rationally. And if the minister acts irrationally, in the extension of the bargaining agreement can be set aside because we live in a legal state. And then finally, if you look at Section 84 of the Labour Relations Act, things like retrenchments, conditions of employment, working hours, all of that will be debated actually at a workplace forum between the two sides. Weirdly, it hasn't happened. And it hasn't happened because we can't get out of the adversarial system we're in. Neither management nor labour wants to actually do that. And so that brings me to my last set of observations. That actually, when people said this is not about labour law, I think they're right. I think that's a cultural question. The question is, how do we get to the point that you're making, which is a much more collaborative form of labour relations? How do we embrace the idea of the workplace forum, which was never ever done? And then, perhaps most important of all, if you look at this research, I suppose what stands out is that we have to ask a really critical question. It is true. Unemployment is probably the single most pressing problem that we have in South Africa at present for all sorts of obvious reasons. But are we not banging on about labour too much? And what's going to happen with the fourth industrial revolution? We're going to have to think through a whole range of challenges, which include education and upskilling and a whole range of questions, which in a sense go way beyond the issue of the strict industrial relations framework which we're in. When you look at someone, if I can end where we started, like Rotenbach, says you've got to get rid of trade unions, get rid of collective bargaining, just let the market do it. Well, there aren't many parts of the world when you've got the sort of society like ours, where just leaving it to the market without more ever gets you to a more egalitarian and participant society. Yes, you will tell me about Singapore, but shit, it's a hell of a difference when you've got 5 million people to 55 million. I think when we probe the issue of wage flexibility, it's not quite as clear as people say it is. Namely, all you do is get to the market. And I think it's strange, it's true, that we talked about American about a little while back, that this idea of trickle-down economics has come back, meaning the idea that, all you have to do is deregulate and jobs will come back and equality will improve. But I think what Thomas Piketty has showed us in the book Capital, 21st Century, the big book that everybody buys and then uses a doorstop, no one reads, right? But if you read the book carefully, there's no question that we're living in the most unequal of times. And Piketty's argument is correct. Inequality began in dramatic fashion with the destruction of the consensus post-Second World War, which was a social democratic consensus. It was when Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher came in and essentially dismantled all of the things that we still have in South Africa, right? And that is to allow the market to work itself pure. It's not just Piketty, but there's now a massive amount of evidence that suggests that Piketty is the best one, right, to show you just how inequality grew exponentially from the mid-1980s. And in a country like South Africa, it seems to me that's an extraordinarily worrying proposition, to suggest that we get rid of all these protections and place our faith in something where empirically it's been suggested actually exacerbates inequality. So I leave you with those thoughts. It is a very, very interesting question. And I suppose, when we start criticizing this, we should all ask ourselves this question to end with, well, what would we do if we were the minister? And the answer, it seems to me, is that this is not just a question of tinkering with the Labour Relations Act. It's a far broader problem. But I'll leave it there. Thank you.